The hum of activity at Lexington International Airport was like a well-rehearsed symphony. Boarding calls echoed over the intercom. The rhythmic roll of luggage wheels filled the terminal, and flight attendants moved with efficient precision, ensuring every passenger was settled. Flight 682 was preparing for departure, a standard evening flight bound for Chicago, and the air inside the aircraft was thick with the usual energy of travelers, both excited and weary. Among them, seated quietly by the window in row 27C, was Mrs. Eleanor Parks. She was a woman of quiet grace, her silver hair neatly pinned into a bun, her attire simple yet elegant, a deep blue cardigan draped over a crisp white blouse. A small leather bag rested on her lap, her hands folded gently over it. To anyone watching, she appeared to be just another elderly traveler, perhaps heading to visit family or simply enjoying a peaceful trip. But what no one realized, not the passengers shifting in their seats, nor the flight attendants bustling up and down the aisles, was that Mrs. Parks was not just another traveler. She was the founder and owner of the airline. At that moment, Rebecca Monroe, a young, ambitious flight attendant, was making her way down the aisle, checking on passengers, distributing last-minute refreshments, and ensuring everything was in order before takeoff. She moved quickly, her brown hair pulled into a tight bun, her uniform crisp and spotless. She prided herself on efficiency and professionalism, though patience had never been her strongest trait. As she reached the back of the plane, she noticed a small child in the row ahead of Mrs. Parks, squirming in his seat, his tiny feet repeatedly kicking against the seat back. His mother, distracted by her phone, barely acknowledged his movements. Rebecca sighed, shifting her weight. It was a minor inconvenience, but one she had learned to address before it escalated into a complaint from another passenger. With a polite but clipped tone, she approached Mrs. Parks, lightly tapping her shoulder. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, tilting her head toward the restless child. "Would you mind switching seats? The little one here is causing a disturbance, and we'd like to keep things running smoothly." Rebecca expected a simple nod of compliance, maybe even gratitude for the offer of a different seat. Instead, Mrs. Parks turned to her slowly, her gaze steady, thoughtful, unreadable. She had traveled frequently over the years and knew well the small inconveniences that came with flying. But something about Rebecca's tone, the subtle edge of impatience, the faint assumption that she would simply comply without question, gave her pause. "I appreciate your concern, Mrs. Parks replied, her voice soft yet firm, "but I'm quite comfortable where I am, thank you." Rebecca's polite smile tightened slightly. She wasn't used to pushback over simple requests. She had worked enough flights to know that passengers usually complied without a second thought. Folding her arms, she shifted her stance. "Ma'am, I'm not sure you understand," she continued, keeping her tone measured but firm. "It would be easier for everyone if you moved to avoid any disruptions." She flicked her eyes toward the child, then back to Mrs. Parks. "We can't have anyone causing a commotion." A few passengers glanced over at the interaction, sensing a subtle shift in the air. Mrs. Parks held Rebecca's gaze, her expression remaining composed. Yet something in her posture shifted, something that made Rebecca feel suddenly uneasy. "I understand perfectly," Mrs. Parks said evenly, her hands still gently folded over her bag. "And I assure you I can manage just fine." Rebecca felt a flare of irritation rise in her chest. Why was this woman being so difficult over something so simple? She had expected compliance, maybe even appreciation for her suggestion. Instead, she felt as though Mrs. Parks was quietly challenging her authority, and that unsettled her in a way she couldn't quite explain. Without another word, Rebecca exhaled sharply and turned away, muttering under her breath, something about how some people these seemed to think the rules didn't apply to them. She didn't expect Mrs. Parks to hear it, but the quiet flicker of amusement in the elderly woman's eyes suggested otherwise. The exchange was brief, hardly a disruption in the grand scheme of the flight, but those who had witnessed it whispered quietly among themselves. Some were unsettled by the tension. Others dismissed it as nothing more than an overly assertive flight attendant clashing with a stubborn passenger. But to those who paid attention, who truly observed the quiet elegance of Mrs. Parks, the way she carried herself, the way she didn't react with indignation or anger, but instead with unwavering composure, there was something about her that didn't quite fit the mold of an ordinary traveler. Rebecca, however, had already put the moment out of her mind. She had other passengers to attend to, other duties to fulfill. In her world, a minor disagreement over a seat wasn't worth dwelling on. What she didn't realize, what she couldn't possibly have known, was that she had just made a mistake that could change the course of her entire career. Because Mrs. Eleanor Parks was not a woman who simply let things slide. She had spent a lifetime building this airline from the ground up, ensuring that every flight operated on the principles of professionalism, respect, and integrity. And though she had never been one to demand special treatment, she had also never tolerated disrespect, especially not from those who wore the uniform of her airline. As the flight attendants moved through their final preparations, Rebecca felt a lingering unease in her chest, though she couldn't pinpoint why. It was a routine flight, just like countless others she had worked before. But something about the way Mrs. Parks had looked at her, not with anger, not with frustration, but with the quiet confidence of someone who knew far more than she let on, made Rebecca feel as if she had unknowingly set something into motion. As Flight 682 began its ascent into the darkening sky, Mrs. Parks turned her gaze back to the window, watching the clouds stretch endlessly before her. There was no anger in her heart, only patience. Because what Rebecca didn't yet understand, but what she soon would, was that even the smallest moments could define a person. In this moment, this was only the beginning. The hum of Flight 682's cabin filled the air, soft whispers of passengers settling in, the gentle clinking of drink carts, and the occasional crackle of the intercom. But within the otherwise calm atmosphere, there was an undercurrent of tension, an invisible ripple created by a single seemingly insignificant exchange. It had lasted no more than a minute, just a brief conversation between a flight attendant and an elderly woman in row 27C. And yet, to those who had been paying attention, it had been anything but ordinary. Rebecca Monroe, an ambitious young flight attendant, had made what she assumed was a simple request, asking the elderly woman, Mrs. Eleanor Parks, to move seats. The reason? A restless child kicking at her seat back. A minor inconvenience, something that could have been handled smoothly, quickly, without a second thought. But what should have been an effortless exchange had turned into something else entirely. The moment Rebecca had leaned down, her tone clipped with professional courtesy, but laced with an unmistakable impatience, Parks had looked up at her, not with confusion or irritation, but with a quiet, measured gaze, the kind of gaze that made people second-guess themselves without ever knowing why. "I'm quite comfortable where I am, thank you," Mrs. Parks had said, soft-spoken but immovable, and that had been enough to ignite an ember of frustration in Rebecca's chest. It wasn't that she had never dealt with stubborn passengers before. She had, plenty of times. People who demanded upgrades, who insisted on bending the rules, who expected to be treated as royalty just because they had paid a little more for their ticket. It was an unspoken rule in the airline industry. Passengers could be difficult, and flight attendants were expected to handle them with grace. But this woman, this elderly passenger in row 27C, wasn't yelling or complaining. She wasn't demanding special treatment or raising her voice. No, she was simply saying no, and somehow that was worse. Rebecca had tightened her grip on her service tablet, her forced smile thinning at the edges. "Ma'am, I'm not sure you understand," she had pressed on, her voice taking on an edge of strained patience. "It would really be easier for everyone if you moved. We want to keep the flight comfortable for all passengers." There it was, that subtle but unmistakable implication. That unspoken suggestion that Miss Parks, by choosing to remain in her seat, was somehow causing a problem. But Mrs. Parks did not flinch, did not shift, did not waver. "I understand perfectly," she had repeated, her tone gentle but unyielding. "And I assure you I can manage just fine." Rebecca had felt heat creep up her neck. Her frustration wasn't entirely rational, and yet it burned all the same. Who was this woman to challenge her? Passengers didn't just say no, they complied. Rebecca had exhaled sharply, her patience slipping as she turned away, muttering under her breath. It had been a careless remark, meant only for herself, but loud enough for those nearby to catch. "Some people think the rules don't apply to them," she had mumbled. A murmur of silence had followed, a pause in the air, as if the plane itself had taken a breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Rebecca didn't look back. She had other things to do, and this wasn't worth dwelling on. But what she failed to notice, what she should have paid more attention to, was the way passengers had begun to shift in their seats. They had heard her. They had seen her subtle flash of irritation. And more importantly, they had seen Mrs. Parks's reaction, or rather her lack of one. She had not scowled or scoffed. She had not retorted with anger or indignation. She had simply sat there, still as stone, poised as ever, watching the clouds drift by beyond the small window beside her. And that, more than anything, was what caught the attention of those around her. Because the average person would have reacted. The average person would have snapped back, or at the very least, let irritation flicker across their features. But Mrs. Parks did neither. Instead, she had let the moment pass, as if it meant nothing, or perhaps as if it meant everything. A few rows ahead, a businessman in a tailored suit had lowered his newspaper, peering discreetly over the top. A young woman in the adjacent seat had paused the movie on her tablet, her brows subtly knitting together. Even the mother of the restless child, who had thus far been buried in earphone, had finally looked up, a flicker of realization dawning on her face. Something about the entire interaction felt off. Passengers exchanged glances, small, knowing looks that suggested they too sensed something unusual about the way the situation had played out. It was in the way Rebecca had reacted, not just frustrated, but unsettled. It was in the way Mrs. Parks had responded, not defiant, but calmly immovable, like someone who had seen this kind of behavior before and already decided it wasn't worth her energy. And most of all, it was in the way the tension still hung in the air, even as Rebecca had walked away, even as the conversation had ended, as if the moment itself had left a mark on the flight that could not be erased. Rebecca, however, remained oblivious. To her, this was just another minor interaction in a long day of dealing with difficult passengers. She had done her job. The matter was settled. But it wasn't, because what Rebecca did not realize, what she could not possibly have known, was that she had just made a mistake she would come to regret. She had dismissed the wrong person. The woman in row 27C was not just another elderly passenger. And by the time this flight landed, Rebecca's world would never be the same. The steady hum of Flight 682's engines filled the cabin, a low, constant rhythm that seemed to underscore the tension brewing beneath the surface. Rebecca Monroe moved methodically through the aisle, her practiced smile in place as she handed out drinks, barely sparing a second glance at the passengers she served. But no matter how much she tried to move past it, her mind kept circling back to row 27C to Miss Eleanor Parks, the elderly woman who had, with nothing more than quiet defiance, managed to unsettle her. She didn't know why it bothered her so much. It wasn't as though she had never encountered passengers who refused to comply with simple requests, but something about the way Mrs. Parks had handled it, the way she had remained calm, unshaken, almost knowing, left Rebecca with an unshakable feeling that she had misjudged the situation entirely. And then, just as she was clearing empty cups from the tray table of a sleeping passenger, it happened. A soft, composed voice cut through the air, calm but commanding enough to immediately capture Rebecca's attention. "Excuse me, dear," Mrs. Parks spoke from her seat, her fingers resting lightly on the armrest. "I'd like to have a word with the captain, when you have a moment." Rebecca's heart skipped a beat. She turned slowly, blinking in confusion. Had she heard that correctly? Passengers didn't just ask to speak with the captain. Rebecca hesitated, gripping the tray just a little tighter. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" Mrs. Parks simply smiled, a smile that carried no warmth, no irritation, just patience. "I'd just like a moment of his time," she said gently. "I'm sure he wouldn't mind." Rebecca stared at her, thrown off balance. There was no accusation in Mrs. Parks' tone, no hint of complaint, and yet, something about her request felt entirely out of the ordinary. Rebecca straightened her posture, forcing herself to regain control of the conversation. "Well, ma'am," she began, her tone clipped with professionalism, "the captain is very busy ensuring we have a safe flight. If there's a concern, I'd be happy to address it for you." Mrs. Parks didn't waver. She simply tilted her head slightly, as if studying Rebecca, as if weighing whether or not it was worth explaining herself to someone who wouldn't understand. Then, with the same unwavering calm, she simply said, "That's all right, dear. Just let him know I asked." Rebecca's fingers curled around the tray. Something about the interaction left her uneasy. Passengers didn't ask to speak with the captain unless something was seriously wrong. Yet, Mrs. Parks wasn't behaving like someone who was upset or nervous. She wasn't demanding an audience with him. She was waiting. For what? For Rebecca to make a mistake? For Rebecca to decide whether or not to take her request seriously? The thought unsettled her more than she cared to admit. With one last glance at Mrs. Parks, who had already returned her attention to the clouds outside her window, Rebecca turned sharply on her heel and headed straight for the cockpit. The captain's reaction. Rebecca barely hesitated before stepping inside, her mind still churning. "Captain," she called lightly, her voice carefully neutral. Captain David Morris, a seasoned pilot with years of experience, turned his head slightly from where he sat at the controls, adjusting a setting on the navigation panel. His co-pilot, First Officer Graham, glanced up as well. Rebecca hesitated, suddenly feeling ridiculous for bringing it up. "It's nothing major," she started, shifting her weight. "Just, there's a passenger asking to speak with you. I told her you were busy, but she insisted." Captain Morris raised an eyebrow, half distracted. "What's the issue?" Rebecca exhaled, trying to frame it in a way that didn't sound as strange as it felt. "She didn't say, just that she wanted a moment of your time. I think she's just one of those difficult passengers." Captain Morris barely reacted, at least not at first. But then as Rebecca continued, he reached for a clipboard on the console and spoke without looking up. "Which passenger?" Rebecca hesitated. "Row 27C, Eleanor Parks." The air in the cockpit shifted instantly. Captain Morris's fingers stopped mid-movement. His head lifted, not abruptly, but with a slow, deliberate precision that sent a flicker of unease down Rebecca's spine. Then he turned fully toward her. "You said Eleanor Parks." Rebecca nodded, uncertain why her stomach suddenly felt tight. There was a brief silence before the captain leaned forward slightly, reaching out his hand. "Give me the manifest." Rebecca blinked. The passenger manifest?" she repeated dumbly. "Now." Something in his tone left no room for hesitation. Wordlessly, Rebecca handed him the tablet containing the flight's passenger information. Captain Morris scanned the screen quickly, his eyes sharp, focused, searching for something specific, and then he found it. Rebecca watched as the color seemed to drain from his face just slightly, not in fear but in realization. A long, heavy pause settled over the cockpit. Then he exhaled, shaking his head once before setting the tablet down. "I'll go speak with her," he said, standing up from his seat. Rebecca blinked in confusion. "What? Wait, you're actually going?" she asked, bewildered. "I thought you—" Captain Morris turned toward her, his usual calm demeanor returning, but now it carried an edge of something else, something almost cautious. "You don't know who she is, do you?" he asked. Rebecca's stomach twisted. "Should I?" she asked hesitantly. Captain Morris sighed, rubbing the back of his neck before stepping past her, heading for the door. "You will soon enough," he muttered. And then, before Rebecca could ask what the hell that was supposed to mean, he was gone, leaving her standing there, cold dread creeping into her chest. Rebecca Monroe stood frozen, the hum of the engines drowning beneath the deafening silence in her own mind. The moment the words left Captain Morris's lips, the floor beneath her seemed to drop away. "You don't know who she is, do you?" The captain's voice had been measured, careful, yet laced with an undeniable weight. And then, as if dropping the final blow, he had turned to her with an expression that made her stomach twist. "You will soon enough." Rebecca's breath hitched, her heartbeat thundered in her chest, but she forced herself to move, to follow. She trailed behind Captain Morris as he walked through the narrow aisle, her mind spiraling with unease. Passengers barely noticed the quiet urgency in the captain's stride, but Rebecca could feel the shift, the subtle, almost imperceptible change in the air. It was like watching the calm before a storm, and yet she had no idea what was coming. Then they reached row 27C. Mrs. Parks sat just as she had before, poised, composed, her silver hair neatly pinned, her hands folded over her lap. She barely glanced up as the captain approached. "Mrs. Parks," Captain Morris greeted, his voice respectful. It's an honor to have you on board. Rebecca's stomach dropped. Mrs. Parks. Again. But this time the captain's tone wasn't casual. It was weighted with recognition. And then it hit her. This wasn't just a random name on the passenger manifest. This wasn't just an elderly woman with an attitude of quiet defiance. No, Rebecca thought, her breath quickening. Captain Morris wasn't just humoring her request. He was acknowledging her. And then, for the first time since stepping onto the plane, Mrs. Parks looked directly at Rebecca, and she smiled, a knowing, patient, almost amused smile. And just like that, Rebecca understood. A cold wave of horror crashed through her veins. This wasn't just any passenger. This wasn't just an elderly woman she had dismissed. Mrs. Eleanor Parks owned the airline. The weight of a mistake, Rebecca could feel the blood drain from her face. Her pulse pounded against her ribs as the full realization settled in, as if her body hadn't quite caught up with the gravity of her mistake. She had spoken down to the founder of the airline. She had dismissed her. She had made her feel like she didn't belong in a seat on the very airline she built. Heat flushed Rebecca's skin, embarrassment colliding violently with panic. Miss Parks wasn't just wealthy. She wasn't just a VIP. She was the person who had the power to end Rebecca's career in a single phone call. She owned the company. She wrote the policies. She signed the paychecks. And Rebecca had disrespected. Captain Morris continued speaking, his tone even, professional, but Rebecca barely heard the words. Everything around her felt distorted, muffled under the weight of her own shame. How had she not known? Why hadn't she recognized the name? Because she hadn't even bothered to look. Her own arrogance, her assumption that Mrs. Parks was just another difficult passenger, had led her straight into a nightmare of her own making. Rebecca dared to glance up, desperate for some kind of signal that this could be salvaged. But Mrs. Parks simply continued to watch her, her expression unreadable. Not angry, not offended, just waiting. And somehow that was even worse. If Mrs. Parks had snapped at her, if she had demanded immediate consequences, maybe Rebecca could have groveled for forgiveness, made some pathetic attempt at redemption. But no, Mrs. Parks was giving her nothing, no outburst, no demand, just silence. And in that silence, Rebecca's world crumbled around her. The final blow. Miss Monroe, disappeared. Mrs. Parks finally spoke, her voice smooth, measured. Rebecca's breath hitched. It was the first time she had addressed her directly, and yet it wasn't harsh or cruel. It was calm, too calm. Rebecca swallowed the lump in her throat, her voice barely steady when she finally spoke. Mrs. Parks, Mrs. Parks simply held up a hand, a gesture so small, so effortless, but one that silenced Rebecca instantly. You assumed I was someone insignificant, Ms. Parks said, and you treated me accordingly. Rebecca's lungs tightened. You believed I didn't matter, Mrs. Parks continued, her gaze unwavering. Because you assumed I held no power over you. Rebecca's heart hammered, and then Mrs. Parks smiled again, but this time there was an edge to it. But you see, Miss Monroe, she finished, power is a funny thing. She leaned in slightly, her voice dipping just enough for only Rebecca to hear the next words. The people you think have none, a pause, often have the most. Rebecca's vision blurred at the edges, her entire body stiff with dread. Her breathing was shallow, her throat dry, and she didn't dare move. Mrs. Parks pulled back, smoothing the wrinkles in her blouse before returning her attention to Captain Morris. I'll be speaking with senior management when we land, she said lightly. Rebecca's stomach clenched, and then the final nail in the coffin. I'd like to have a discussion about how your crew is trained on customer respect, Mrs. Parks added, her voice calm, almost casual. Captain Morris nodded stiffly. Of course, Mrs. Parks. We'll arrange that immediately. Rebecca's heart plummeted. Her head was spinning, her entire future teetering on the edge of a knife. Was she about to lose everything? Was this it? She wanted to beg, to plead, to somehow undo the last 2 hours, but she knew it was useless. Rebecca had made her choice, and now she had to live with it. A lesson in power. Rebecca didn't move as Captain Morris turned, as Mrs. Parks settled back into her seat, as the world around her continued as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. Her fate now rested in the hands of the very woman she had disrespected. Would Mrs. Parks end her career? Would she be blacklisted from the airline industry entirely? Or would Mrs. Parks give her a second chance? Rebecca didn't know. And that was the worst part. What do you think will happen next? Should Mrs. Parks forgive Rebecca? Or should she face the consequences of her mistake? Comment below with your thoughts. And if you love stories of power, redemption, and second chances, don't forget to like and subscribe. Because trust me, this isn't over. Rebecca Monroe felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest like a storm cloud about to break. She had made a terrible mistake, and there was no undoing it. The knowledge sat like a heavy stone in her stomach, cold and unmovable. Mrs. Eleanor Parks, the woman she had dismissed, the passenger she had treated with impatience, wasn't just another elderly traveler. She owned the airline. She held the power to dictate the future of every flight attendant who worked for the company, and that included Rebecca. Yet, Mrs. Parks had not raised her voice, had not demanded an apology, had not called for immediate action against her. Instead, she had done something far worse. She had watched. She had noted every detail. She had let Rebecca walk away without a single reprimand, without a word of forgiveness. And that terrified Rebecca more than anything. She knew what was coming, a reckoning. And yet, the silence stretched on. Captain Morris warning. Rebecca tried to steady her breathing, tried to focus on the usual rhythm of her duties, but it was useless. Every time she passed by row 27C, her pulse quickened, her hands felt colder, and she couldn't shake the burning sensation of Mrs. Parks's presence. The older woman did nothing to add to Rebecca's suffering. She didn't glare. She didn't whisper to other passengers. She just sat there watching, calm, composed, and utterly in control. It was unbearable. Rebecca felt like a prisoner waiting for her sentence. By the time the flight had reached its final hour, Captain Morris found her in the galley, standing still as if paralyzed. The usual hustle of the crew felt distant, muffled, as if she had been swallowed into another reality entirely. "Rebecca," he said in a low voice. She snapped her head toward him, her heart lodging itself in her throat. "I don't know what exactly happened back there," the captain said, his voice measured, his eyes sharp. "But I know Mrs. Parks well enough to tell you this. She does not take disrespect lightly." Rebecca swallowed hard. "I didn't mean—" The captain raised a hand, silencing her instantly. "Intent doesn't matter," he said. "Impact does." Rebecca looked away, her cheeks burning. "I thought she was just another passenger," she murmured, barely recognizing the sound of her own voice. Captain Morris let out a quiet sigh, shaking his head. "That's the problem, Rebecca. You assumed." Rebecca winced, the words cutting through her like ice. She had prided herself on her professionalism, on her ability to handle passengers with ease. And yet, in one moment of blind arrogance, she had reduced a woman of unimaginable power to just another passenger. She had failed at Bahamon, and now she was about to pay the price. The last hour of the flight, the final hour of the flight, passed in a haze of tension and dread. Rebecca moved robotically through the cabin, avoiding Mrs. Parks' gaze at all costs. Every time she heard laughter, every time she caught a whisper of conversation, she imagined it was about her. Did the other passengers know? Had they seen it? Were they watching and waiting for Mrs. Parks to deliver her punishment? By the time the landing announcement came over the speakers, Rebecca's hands were clammy, her uniform clinging uncomfortably to her back. She went through the motions, checking seatbelts, securing the cabin, but her mind was far from the routine. She could barely breathe, because she knew. Once they landed, Mrs. Parks would make her decision. Would she demand her immediate termination? Would she call for a formal review, ensuring Rebecca's name was stained forever in the airline's record? Or worse, would she say nothing at all and let the fear eat Rebecca alive? The flight lands, and the judgment begins. The wheels of the plane hit the runway, and Rebecca felt her body lock in place. This was it. As passengers began unbuckling their seatbelts, stretching and gathering their belongings, Rebecca barely moved. She knew she had to help with the disembarkation, but her limbs felt stiff, her throat dry. Then, Mrs. Parks stood up. Rebecca's breath hitched. This was it. This was the moment she had been dreading. Mrs. Parks didn't hurry. She took her time, adjusting her blazer, smoothing out her scarf before retrieving her small leather bag. Passengers passed by her, but no one rushed her. Rebecca couldn't move. Then Mrs. Parks turned her head, just slightly, her eyes meeting Rebecca's. A quiet moment, a pulse of something unreadable. Then she walked past her. No words, no expression of anger, nothing. Rebecca's stomach plummeted. It wasn't relief, it wasn't mercy, it was worse. It was a sentence left unfinished. A verdict yet to be spoken. And that meant one thing: Mrs. Parks wasn't done with her yet. What happens next? Rebecca barely managed to get through the final steps of the flight's closure. As the last passengers stepped off, Captain Morris gave her a knowing look, one that sent another chill through her body. "Stay put," he said simply. "She'll call for you soon." Rebecca's stomach churned, nausea creeping up her throat. Her fate was now in the hands of Mrs. Eleanor Parks. And the worst part? She had no idea what that meant. Would she be fired? Would she be given a chance to redeem herself? Or had she just made the worst mistake of her career? One thing was certain: she would find out soon enough. Rebecca Monroe had never felt time move so slowly. The final minutes of the flight stretched endlessly before her, each second dragging like a weight against her chest. She had made mistakes before, forgotten drink orders, minor seating misunderstandings. But this was different. This was Mrs. Eleanor Parks, the woman who owned the airline, the woman who had the power to end Rebecca's career with a single word. And Rebecca had disrespected her. She swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she adjusted a tray in the galley. Her fingers felt ice cold, her breath shallow and uneven. Every step she took down the aisle, every glance from a passenger, made her stomach tighten further. Had they noticed? Did they know what she had done? Was Mrs. Parks watching her right now? Rebecca dared to look toward row 27C, her heart pounding against her ribs. Mrs. Parks sat calmly by the window, her hands gently folded in her lap. She was not reading, not scrolling through a phone, not sleeping. She was just sitting there, composed, quiet, and unshaken. Rebecca's pulse quickened. The silence was worse than anger. If Mrs. Parks had confronted her, if she had called for a manager, if she had demanded action, at least Rebecca would have known where she stood. But this was waiting for the storm to break. Each moment feels like a lifetime. Rebecca tried to focus on her tasks, but her thoughts spun in an endless loop. Had she ruined her career? Would she step off this plane only to be met by security, escorted off like a criminal? Her feet felt heavier as she walked down the aisle, as if she were carrying the weight of the entire plane on her back. And then, the final announcement came over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin our descent shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and your tray tables are in the upright position." Rebecca exhaled sharply. The moment was coming fast. She forced herself into autopilot, moving between the rows, checking seatbelts, and collecting last-minute trash. But with every passenger she passed, her vision blurred slightly, her body betraying the deep anxiety clawing at her chest. Then, she reached row 27C. Mrs. Parks looked up. For the first time since Rebecca had dismissed her earlier, their eyes met. Rebecca's throat went dry. Mrs. Parks didn't frown. She didn't glare. She simply observed Rebecca with an expression that sent a sharp, cutting chill through her bones. There was no anger, just something worse: disappointment. Rebecca's breath hitched. She opened her mouth to say something, anything, but no words came. Mrs. Parks held her gaze for one long, excruciating second. Then, without a word, she turned back to the window. Rebecca stood frozen, her chest tight, her heart pounding painfully against her ribs. This was not over. Not even close. The landing that feels like a sentence, the plane descended through the clouds, the cabin filling with the low hum of engines and murmured conversations. But Rebecca heard none of it. All she could hear was the hammering of her own pulse, the deafening silence between her and Mrs. Parks. Her mind raced. Would Mrs. Parks report her immediately upon landing? Would she call for management before Rebecca even had a chance to apologize? What could she even say that would fix this? The wheels hit the tarmac with a jolt, and Rebecca felt her stomach drop. She gripped the edge of the galley counter to steady herself. Passengers were already unbuckling their seatbelts, stretching, reaching for their bags. The usual post-landing routine played out around her, but Rebecca felt like she was standing at the edge of a cliff. One wrong step, and she would fall. She barely noticed as passengers filed out of the plane, their voices a blur of casual conversations and travel plans. Then, Mrs. Parks stood. Rebecca held her breath. Mrs. Parks moved gracefully, taking her time, gathering her belongings with practiced ease. Then, as she stepped forward, she paused, just inches from Rebecca. Rebecca's lungs seized. She wanted to speak, to apologize, to beg for understanding. But Mrs. Parks spoke first. Her voice was calm, controlled, and utterly unshakable. "Respect," she said softly, "is a choice." Rebecca felt her knees go weak. Mrs. Parks tilted her head slightly, as if studying her. "And choices have consequences." A pause, then a quiet, knowing smile. "Accountability will follow." Rebecca's chest tightened, her stomach twisting into knots. Mrs. Parks did not elaborate. She did not give a final warning. She simply turned and walked off the plane. And Rebecca was left standing there, staring at the empty space where Mrs. Parks had been, her heart slamming against her ribs, her breath coming too fast, too shallow. This was not just a reprimand. This was a promise. Mrs. Parks had spoken, and now Rebecca's fate was sealed. What happens now? Would Mrs. Parks call management immediately? Would Rebecca be fired before she even had the chance to explain herself? Or was this just the beginning of something much, much worse? One thing was certain, she would find out soon enough. Rebecca Monroe stared at the email on her phone, her hands trembling slightly as she read the words over and over again. "Dear Ms. Monroe, you are requested to attend a private meeting with Mrs. Eleanor Parks at our corporate headquarters. This meeting will take place tomorrow at 2 p.m. sharp. Please confirm your attendance immediately. Sincerely, HR Department." Her breath hitched. Tomorrow, 2 p.m. It was happening. She felt a lump form in her throat. This wasn't just a conversation. This wasn't just a debriefing about the flight. This was Judgment Day. She had spent the last few days drowning in uncertainty, waiting for the moment when she would be called into an office, when someone would pull her aside and tell her her career was over. She had expected an immediate termination, maybe even a company-wide example made of her mistake. But instead, Mrs. Parks had done something far worse. She had given Rebecca time to think, and now she had requested to speak with her in person. Rebecca's stomach twisted with anxiety. What did this mean? Was this a second chance? Or was this just a more personal way of telling her she was finished? She exhaled shakily, her fingers hovering over the reply button. She had no choice. Rebecca typed out 2 words. "I'll be there." And with that, her fate was sealed. The longest night of her life, Rebecca barely slept. The hours ticked by painfully slow, her thoughts looping endlessly. She replayed every moment of that flight, her tone, her words, the way she had dismissed Mrs. Parks without a second thought. The moment when Mrs. Parks had looked her in the eye and said, "Respect is a choice, and choices have consequences." The way she had walked away without raising her voice, yet still left Rebecca paralyzed with fear. Had she already decided Rebecca's fate? Rebecca tossed and turned in bed, but no amount of exhaustion could bring sleep. She was stuck in a cycle of regret and panic, haunted by the weight of what was coming. By the time her alarm rang, she was already awake. Walking into the unknown, Rebecca stepped into the towering glass building of the airline's corporate headquarters, her nerves threatening to consume her. Everything about this place felt too polished, too intimidating, like she didn't belong, like she was an imposter in a world where people like Mrs. Parks made the rules. She checked in at the front desk, her voice barely above a whisper. The receptionist gave her a neutral nod. "Miss Parks is expecting you. Please take a seat." Rebecca obeyed, sitting stiffly in the modern waiting area. The silence was oppressive. Her heart pounded in her chest. Her palms were damp. She fought the urge to tap her foot, to fidget, to do anything but sit here in suffocating stillness. Then the elevator doors slid open, and there she was, Mrs. Eleanor Parks. She walked with unshakable poise, dressed in an impeccably tailored black suit, her silver hair pinned in place. Her expression was unreadable. her sharp eyes scanning the room before settling directly on Rebecca. Rebecca felt her throat tighten. Then Mrs. Parks spoke. "Ms. Monroe, follow me." Her voice was calm, controlled, but there was no room for hesitation. Rebecca scrambled to her feet, her stomach twisting violently as she followed Mrs. Parks down a long hallway. With every step, she felt smaller, more insignificant, more at the mercy of the woman walking just ahead of her. She wanted to apologize immediately, to blurt out everything she had rehearsed in her mind. "I was wrong, I was unprofessional. I deeply regret my behavior." But she didn't dare speak before Mrs. Parks gave her permission to. They entered a small, private conference room. No distractions, no formalities, just a table, two chairs, and the quiet power of a woman who held Rebecca's career in her hands. Mrs. Parks gestured for Rebecca to sit. She obeyed. Then, after a long moment of silence, Mrs. Parks spoke. "Do you know why you're here?" Rebecca swallowed. "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Parks arched a brow. "Do you?" Rebecca's hands curled into fists against her lap. She had to be honest. "Because I disrespected you," she said, her voice small but firm. "Because I dismissed you without thinking. Because I made assumptions about who you were instead of treating you with the respect every passenger deserves." She met Mrs. Parks' gaze, her heart hammering in her chest. "And I regret it more than I can explain." A long silence. Then, Mrs. Parks leaned forward slightly, her eyes searching Rebecca's face with quiet intensity. "Regret isn't enough," she said simply. Rebecca's stomach clenched. "I know." Mrs. Parks tilted her head. "Then tell me, what have you learned?" Rebecca inhaled sharply, gripping her hands together. "That respect isn't about status. It isn't about who someone is or what they can do for me." Her voice trembled slightly, but she kept going. "It's about character, about integrity, and about how I choose to treat people, even when I think no one is watching." She took a shaky breath. "I failed that test on that flight, but I don't ever want to make that mistake again." Mrs. Parks was silent. For a terrifying moment, Rebecca thought maybe, just maybe, she had already lost. Then Mrs. Parks exhaled slowly, her expression unreadable. "Good." Rebecca blinked. "Ma'am?" Mrs. Parks studied her carefully. "You've learned the right lesson. That's more than I can say for most." Rebecca's breath hitched. "Does that mean—" Mrs. Parks held up a hand, cutting her off. "This isn't forgiveness, Ms. Monroe." Rebecca froze. Mrs. Parks's eyes locked onto hers, sharp and unwavering. "This is an opportunity, one chance. Do not waste it." A rush of relief threatened to overwhelm Rebecca, but she held it back, forcing herself to remain composed. She nodded quickly, her voice firm. "I won't." For the first time, Mrs. Parks gave her a slight, knowing smile. "See that you don't." Then, just like that, the meeting was over. Rebecca left the office feeling lightheaded, exhausted, and overwhelmed with gratitude. She hadn't been fired, but she wasn't in the clear yet. She had one shot to prove that she had changed. And she was going to take it, no matter what. Rebecca Monroe stepped out of the conference room, feeling like she had just survived an interrogation. Her heart was still racing, her palms still damp with sweat, and yet, against all odds, she had been given another chance. One chance. That was all Mrs. Eleanor Parks had offered her. Not forgiveness, not sympathy, just an opportunity, one that could just as easily be taken away if she didn't prove herself. Rebecca exhaled shakily, pressing her hands against the cold surface of the hallway's marble wall. She had spent the past few days terrified that she would be fired, that she would be humiliated, that her career would end before it had even truly begun. But Mrs. Parks had seen something in her, something worth testing. Not trusting, not yet, just testing. Rebecca wasn't sure if that made her feel relieved or even more afraid. The weight of the expectations placed upon her settled like a stone in her stomach. This wasn't just about fixing a mistake. It was about proving that she deserved to wear that uniform. And that meant every move she made from this moment forward had to be perfect. The first test, a flight unlike any other. Her first shift back wasn't just a flight, it was a silent trial. The moment she stepped onto the plane, she could feel the stares. Some of the senior flight attendants knew what had happened. Others had heard whispers of a scandal, something about an incident involving Mrs. Parks herself. They didn't know the full details, but they knew one thing. Rebecca had been on the verge of losing everything. She could feel the weight of their judgment. Would she crumble? Would she break under the pressure? Would she fall back into old habits? Rebecca straightened her posture, forced herself to breathe deeply, and pushed forward. She wasn't going to fail this test. The first passenger who needed assistance was an elderly woman struggling with her carry-on. Rebecca didn't hesitate. She moved swiftly, gently taking the bag and lifting it into the overhead bin. "Take your time getting settled, ma'am," she said with a warm smile. "If you need anything, just let me know." It was a small moment, one she had performed countless times before, but this time she paid attention. She watched as the woman sighed in relief, as the tension left her shoulders, as she murmured a quiet thank you before sitting down. That was the difference. Before, Rebecca had gone through the motions. She had seen passengers as part of her job, rather than as individuals who needed care, patience, and attention. Now, every action mattered. Every moment was an opportunity to prove herself. The unexpected challenge, an unruly passenger. Halfway through the flight, the real test arrived. A businessman in seat 4A was furious. His first-class meal had arrived incorrectly prepared, and he was not happy about it. "I paid for a first-class experience," he snapped, his voice carrying over the cabin. "This is unacceptable. I expect better from this airline." Rebecca saw how the other flight attendants hesitated, watching to see if she would step up. She did. She approached calmly, keeping her voice steady, professional, and measured. "I sincerely apologize, sir," she said, maintaining eye contact. "That's not the standard we aim for, and I understand why you're frustrated. Let me fix this for you immediately." She didn't deflect. She didn't brush him off. She owned the mistake and worked to correct it. Within minutes, she personally returned with his properly prepared meal, ensuring that every detail was exactly as he had ordered. She even added, "I appreciate your patience, and I want to make sure you leave this flight feeling satisfied with our service." The man eyed her for a moment, as if weighing whether or not he wanted to keep arguing. Finally, he sighed. "You handled that well," he muttered, picking up his fork. "Better than most." Rebecca exhaled silently, knowing that she had just passed another invisible test. An even bigger test. The flight crew passengers weren't the only ones watching her. The crew had their own unspoken judgments. Some of them weren't sure if Rebecca deserved a second chance. One of the more senior attendants, Lisa, approached her near the galley as she prepared coffee service. "I heard about what happened," Lisa said bluntly. Rebecca's hands stiffened as she placed a coffee cup onto a tray. Here it was, the moment of truth. She turned to Lisa, keeping her tone measured but honest. "I made a mistake," she admitted, "and I don't expect anyone to forget that overnight. But I'm working to be better." Lisa studied her for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Good," she said simply. "That's all anyone wants to see." Rebecca let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The final test, a familiar face. As the flight neared its end, Rebecca was making her final rounds when she spotted a woman in seat 3B reading a book, Mrs. Eleanor Parks. Her breath hitched. Mrs. Parks hadn't made herself known at any point during the flight. She had watched, observed, but never once interfered. Rebecca approached her cautiously. "Mrs. Parks," she said, her voice soft but steady. The woman looked up, her sharp eyes studying Rebecca carefully. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, "I've been watching you, Ms. Monroe." Rebecca swallowed. She knew that. Mrs. Parks closed her book slowly. "You handled yourself well today." The words stunned Rebecca. She had expected neutrality. She had expected indifference. But this was approval, not forgiveness. Not yet, but acknowledgement. "Thank you, ma'am," Rebecca said quietly. Mrs. Parks nodded once, then returned to her book. And just like that, Rebecca knew she was on the right path, a new beginning. As the plane landed and passengers began to disembark, Rebecca felt different. She wasn't the same flight attendant who had started this journey. She had been humbled, tested, and forced to grow. And she wasn't done yet. This was only the beginning. What would you do? If you were in Rebecca's shoes, would you have handled things the same way? Or do you think Parks was too hard on her? Comment your thoughts below. And if you love stories of redemption, growth, and second chances, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because Rebecca's journey, it's far from over. The past few months had been anything but easy for Rebecca Monroe. Every shift, every interaction, every second she spent in her uniform felt like a silent test. Her first mistake had nearly cost her everything: her reputation, her career, her sense of self-worth. But she had been given a second chance, and she refused to waste it. Every day, she showed up determined to prove herself, not just to her superiors, but to herself. She greeted passengers with genuine warmth. She handled difficult situations with grace and patience. She didn't just go through the motions. She made sure that every person she encountered felt valued, respected, and heard, and people noticed. Captain Morris, who had once warned her of the consequences of her arrogance, now watched her with something closer to pride. The other flight attendants, some of whom had doubted her, began to trust her again. Rebecca was earning her place back. But she didn't know that the true test was yet to come. And this time it wouldn't be a private conversation behind closed doors. This time the entire world would be watching. A flight unlike any other, the morning started just like any other. Rebecca adjusted her uniform, smoothed the fabric down with steady hands, and breathed deeply. It was just another flight, another opportunity to do her job well. She had no idea that by the end of it, her name would be on every passenger's lips. As boarding began, she moved efficiently, helping passengers find their seats, assisting with overhead luggage, and offering polite professional smiles. But then she saw her. At the very front of the first-class cabin, seated by the window, dressed in elegant yet understated attire, a book resting in her hands. Mrs. Eleanor Parks. Rebecca felt her stomach tighten. It had been months since their last interaction. She had worked tirelessly to prove herself since then, but she had no idea if Mrs. Parks had been watching. Had she noticed her progress? Had she already made up her mind? Rebecca's heartbeat thundered in her ears, but she kept her expression neutral, professional. She refused to let the nerves show. And then, Mrs. Parks looked up. Their eyes met. Rebecca inclined her head slightly in a respectful nod, keeping her face composed. Mrs. Parks didn't react. She simply observed. Then, without a word, she returned to her book. Rebecca exhaled slowly. If this was another test, she was ready. The emergency that changed everything. The first hour of the flight passed smoothly. Passengers settled in, enjoying their meals, scrolling through in-flight entertainment, or dozing off against the soft hum of the plane's engines. Rebecca moved through the aisles with purpose. She felt lighter these days, more confident in her role. Then, it happened. A sudden commotion in row 14. A passenger, a middle-aged man, clutched his chest, his face twisted in pain. The woman beside him screamed, grabbing his arm. "Help! Something's wrong! He can't breathe!" In an instant, Rebecca sprang into action. She rushed down the aisle, dropping to her knees beside the man. "Sir, can you hear me?" she asked, her voice steady despite the panic rising in the air around them. He gasped, his face pale, his hands trembling. I can't." His breath hitched, his entire body seizing up. Passengers turned in their seats, eyes wide with fear. Someone sobbed. Others whispered anxiously. A flight attendant near the front grabbed the intercom. "Is there a doctor on board?" Silence. No response. Rebecca's chest tightened, but she didn't hesitate. "I need the medical kit," she called over her shoulder. Another flight attendant rushed to retrieve it. Rebecca turned back to the man, pressing 2 fingers to his pulse. It was weak, too weak. His breathing was shallow. She forced herself to stay calm, think, act. She remembered her training, remembered every emergency drill she had ever practiced. And most of all, she remembered who she wanted to be. She wasn't the flight attendant from months ago, the one who thought she was above others, who dismissed people, who made assumptions without care. She was better than that now, and she would not let this man die on her watch. The medical kit arrived, and Rebecca moved quickly, expertly, efficiently. She administered oxygen, monitored his vitals, and spoke to him the entire time. "Stay with me," she urged, her voice gentle but firm. "Help is coming. I need you to keep breathing. Can you do that?" He nodded weakly, his eyes fluttering open, Tears welled in the eyes of the woman beside him. Rebecca didn't leave his side, not when the pilot called in an emergency landing, not when the paramedics boarded the plane, not until they took him safely off the aircraft, his wife whispering a choked, grateful thank you as they left. Only then did Rebecca stand, letting out a shaky breath. The cabin was silent. Passengers stared at her, their expressions shifting from panic to something else. Respect. A quiet, growing applause rippled through the cabin. She turned and locked eyes with Mrs. Parks. For the first time since Rebecca had met her, Mrs. Parks smiled, and then she nodded. A single simple motion. But Rebecca knew exactly what it meant. She had finally proven herself, not through words, not through empty promises, through actions. And that was all that mattered. The journey isn't over, and neither is yours. Rebecca's story isn't just about one mistake. It's about growth. It's about becoming better. It's about learning that redemption isn't given. It's earned. Have you ever made a mistake that nearly cost you everything? Have you ever wanted to prove that you could change? Rebecca did, and you can too. Comment below with your thoughts on her journey. And if you believe in second chances, in redemption, in the power of proving yourself through action, like this post, support Rebecca's growth, and subscribe for more inspiring stories that remind us all. The past doesn't define you. What you do next does. Rebecca's redemption, the leader she was meant to be. The journey had been long, the lessons had been hard, the mistakes had been painful. But Rebecca Monroe had fought for her redemption, and she had won. The flight where she had saved a man's life had changed everything. Not because it made headlines, not because people whispered about it in the break room, but because it was the final proof that she had truly changed. And someone very important had been watching. Mrs. Eleanor Parks, the woman who had once tested her, the woman who had once been the reason she feared for her career, the woman who more than anyone understood what it meant to fall and what it meant to rise again. Rebecca didn't expect anything more to come from it. She had done her job. She had proven herself, and that was enough. Or so she thought, until one life-changing email appeared in her inbox. Subject, we'd like to meet with you. The meeting that changed everything. Rebecca sat in the airline's corporate headquarters, her hands clasped in her lap. The same headquarters she once dreaded stepping into. The same kind of meeting that, months ago, had nearly ended her career. But today, it felt different. Today she wasn't here because of a mistake. Today, she was here because of who she had become. The door opened. Mrs. Parks entered, graceful and poised as always. But this time she wasn't studying Rebecca with quiet judgment. This time, she was smiling. Rebecca, Mrs. Parks said, settling into the chair across from her, "You've impressed me." Rebecca's breath hitched. This woman, this powerful, unshakable woman, had just said she was impressed. "I've been watching you," Mrs. Parks continued. "I've seen how you've carried yourself since our first encounter. I've watched you turn a lesson into a transformation. And most importantly, I've seen you lift others up along the way." Rebecca swallowed hard, but she didn't look away. She had worked for this moment. She had earned it. Mrs. Parks slid a neatly printed document across the table. "I want you to take on a leadership position," she said simply. Rebecca's hands trembled as she picked up the paper. Her promotion letter. It was real. It was happening. She wasn't just being forgiven, she was being entrusted with more responsibility. This wasn't just about Rebecca's growth anymore. This was about helping others grow. This was full circle. She had learned humility, respect, and leadership. And now it was her turn to teach it. Rebecca exhaled a shaky breath, looking up at Mrs. Parks with deep, unwavering gratitude. "I won't let you down," she said, and she meant every single word. Mrs. Parks smiled. "I know. From a mistake to a mission." Rebecca stepped onto her next flight not as just another flight attendant, but as a leader. The other crew members looked to her for guidance, for reassurance, for example. And she was ready to be the leader she once wished she had. She saw herself in the new hires, eager but inexperienced, learning the ropes, making small mistakes. Instead of judging them, she mentored them. Instead of assuming, she listened. Instead of correcting with criticism, she corrected with care. She had once been the arrogant one. She had once been the one who thought she knew it all, and she had been humbled. But now Now she was the one who inspired. She was the one who set the tone for the entire team. And the best part? She wasn't just respected because of her title. She was respected because she had earned it. Through action, through growth, through proving day after day that she was not the same woman she had once been. This was who she was always meant to be. What Rebecca's story can teach us all. Rebecca's story isn't just about a flight attendant. It's about every single one of us. We've all made mistakes. We've all had moments where we thought, I can't come back from this. We've all felt ashamed, humiliated, afraid that we've lost our chance. But here's the truth, a mistake does not define you. What you do next does. Rebecca didn't let her mistake be the end of her story. She fought, she worked, she grew. And because of that, she didn't just survive. She thrived, she became better, stronger, wiser. And so can you. If you've ever felt like you lost your way, if you've ever felt like you were at rock bottom, if you've ever wondered if you could come back from a failure, you can, but it's not about what you say. It's about what you do. So take responsibility, learn from it, grow from it. And one day, just like Rebecca, you'll look back and realize that the mistake that almost ruined you was actually the thing that built you into the person you were meant to be. Like, comment, and subscribe, because this is just the beginning. Rebecca's story isn't just a story, it's a reminder that we are all capable of change. It's proof that growth is possible. And if you believe in second chances, in redemption, in proving yourself through action, then show your support. Like this post if you believe in Rebecca's journey. Comment below, have you ever made a mistake that changed your life? What did you learn from it? Subscribe to this channel for more stories that inspire, motivate, and remind us that our past does not define us. Our actions do. This is just the beginning, and your story is still being written.